Chapter 1: The Birth of New York. From wilderness to world stage, the morning mist hung low over the island as the first light of dawn crept through the ancient chestnut and oak forests. Somewhere in the distance, a red-tailed hawk circled above the salt marshes, its sharp eyes scanning for movement among the reeds. The Lenape people, who had called this land Mannahatta for generations, were already beginning their day, fishermen checking their weirs in the East River, women preparing the morning meal of corn, beans, and squash, children laughing as they chased each other through stands of towering tulip trees. To these original inhabitants, the island was not property to be owned, but a living gift to be shared. Its rhythms as familiar as their own heartbeat. This peaceful existence was about to change forever. On an autumn day in the year 1609, a strange vessel appeared on the horizon. The Half Moon, a Dutch East India Company ship commanded by the English explorer Henry Hudson, dropped anchor in what would later be called New York Harbor. Hudson's journal entries from that September describe a great and spacious bay with many good harbors for all winds. His crew traded metal tools and colorful cloth with curious Lenape, who paddled out in dugout canoes, unaware that this encounter would alter the destiny of their homeland forever. The Dutch saw immediate potential in this sheltered harbor with its deep waterways, packed tightly in wooden chests, farming tools, Bibles, and precious seeds for the crops they hoped would sustain them in this unfamiliar land. They built crude, thatch-roofed dwellings near the southern tip of the island, close to the protective walls of Fort Amsterdam. The settlement they called New Amsterdam was born not as a grand city, but as a precarious outpost in the wilderness. Life in those early years was harsh and unpredictable. Summers brought swarms of mosquitoes rising from the marshes, and with them deadly fevers. The colonists struggled to grow European crops in the unfamiliar soil, often relying on the generosity of the Lenape to avoid starvation. Peter Minuit, the settlement's third director, famously acquired the island in 1626 through a transaction whose details remain controversial to this day. The supposed purchase of Manhattan for 60 guilders worth of trade goods, about $24 in modern currency, likely reflected a cultural misunderstanding rather than a true sale. New Amsterdam developed where sailors, fresh off months at sea, drank heavily and brawled in the muddy lanes. The colony's most colorful leader, Peter Stuyvesant, arrived in 1647, sporting a silver-tipped wooden leg. His strict Calvinist beliefs clashed with the rowdy reality of New Amsterdam. He banned Sunday drinking, attempted to outlaw Christmas celebrations, and once ordered the public whipping of a man for stealing peaches from his orchard. Yet, despite Stuyvesant's authoritarian rule, the Dutch West India Company, more interested in profits than morality, encouraged immigration from across Europe. Walloon Protestants, French Huguenots, Sephardic Jews fleeing Brazil, and even the first enslaved Africans all contributed to the colony's diverse character. By 1656, the settlement had grown enough to warrant an official city charter, complete with a shout, sheriff, burgomasters, mayors, and sheepins, aldermen. The winds of change blew in from England during the summer of 1660. 4 British warships under the command of Colonel Richard Nichols sailed into the harbor, their cannons trained on the undermanned fort. Stuyvesant, ever the soldier, wanted to fight despite impossible odds. But the pragmatic merchants of New Amsterdam, recognizing the inevitable and perhaps weary of their governor's heavy-handed rule, persuaded him to surrender peacefully. On September 8, 1664, New Amsterdam became New York, named in honor of the Duke of York, brother to King Charles II. The English period brought dramatic changes to the growing city. The new colonial government converted the former Dutch church on Pearl Street into an Anglican house of worship. The old Dutch street names gradually disappeared. Though some like Breed, Weg Broadway, and Bowery, the Boweries stubbornly persisted. Most significantly, the English expanded the slave trade that had begun under Dutch rule. By the early 1700s, enslaved Africans comprised nearly 20% of New York's population. Their forced labor building the infrastructure of the growing city. New York's strategic importance became undeniable during the American Revolution. After George Washington's defeat at the Battle of Long Island in 1776, the British occupied the city for 7 long years. The Great Fire of 1776 destroyed nearly 500 buildings, about a quarter of the city in a single catastrophic night. Some blamed revolutionary sympathizers, others suspected careless British soldiers. Regardless of its origin, the Erie Canal, markets via New York Harbor of goods, Wall Street emerged as the nation's financial center. Its banks financing westward expansion and industrial ventures. By the eve of the Civil War, New York had transformed from a sleepy colonial outpost into a bustling metropolis. The city's newspapers circulated nationwide, its theaters set cultural trends, and its merchants dominated global trade. The foundations had been laid in brick and mortar, in law and custom, in the very spirit of the place, for the rise of a city that would come to dominate the world stage. But this was merely the opening act in New York's extraordinary drama. The age of skyscrapers and subway trains, of immigrant dreams and financial empires, of artistic revolutions and social upheavals, all of that was yet to come. For New York, the greatest story was always the next one. Chapter 2: Revolution and Renaissance. New York's slow crucible of fire and freedom. The acrid smell of gunpowder still hung in the air over New York Harbor on a sultry July morning in 1776, just days after the Declaration of Independence had been read aloud to Washington's troops. The city stood at a crossroads, both literally and historically. Its muddy streets filled with the hurried footsteps of patriots and loyalists alike. British warships, their cannons glinting ominously in the sunlight, now controlled the East River, while in taverns like the Queen's Head, later France's Tavern, whispers of rebellion passed between tankards of ale. New York was about to become the stage for the most dramatic acts of the American Revolution, a crucible where the very idea of America would be forged in fire and blood. The tension had been building for years. New York's merchants had grown wealthy through trade with England, yet many chafed under the Crown's increasing taxes and restrictions. The Sons of Liberty, a secret society of patriots, had been meeting in the back rooms of printing shops and coffee houses, their ranks filled with fiery orators like Isaac Sears and Alexander McDougall. In 1765, they erected a Liberty pole in what is now City Hall Park, a defiant symbol that British soldiers repeatedly chopped down, only to see it rise again. The conflict reached its boiling point in 1770. when British troops fired into a taunting crowd near John Street, killing several New Yorkers in what became known as the Battle of Golden Hill. It was, in many ways, the first blood spilled in the American Revolution. When war finally came in earnest, New York became the ultimate prize. Its deep harbor and central location made it strategically vital, and both sides knew whoever controlled Manhattan could dictate the flow of the war. George Washington, recognizing this, rushed his Continental Army to fortify the city in early 1776. Soldiers from Massachusetts and Pennsylvania dug trenches through what is now Chinatown, while artillery batteries were hastily constructed along the battery's shoreline. The tension was palpable in the evening of July 9th. After Washington had the Declaration of Independence read to his troops in City Hall Park, an ecstatic mob toppled the gilded statue of King George III that stood at Bowling Green. The lead from this monument would later be melted down into musket balls, literally turning symbols of monarchy into weapons of revolution. Then came the fire. On the night of September 20th, 1776, just days after the British captured the city, a mysterious blaze erupted in a tavern near Whitehall Slip. Fanned by strong winds, the flames raced through the wooden buildings of Lower Manhattan, consuming nearly 500 structures in a single apocalyptic night. Patriots claimed it was divine intervention. British officers accused rebel arsonists. The truth remains lost to history. But the Great Fire of 1776 would forever alter New York's physical and psychological landscape. For the next 7 years, the city became a British stronghold, a place of glittering balls for officers and brutal prison ships for captured patriots in Wallabout Bay, modern-day Brooklyn Navy Yard, where more Americans died in captivity than in every battle of the war combined. Yet even in occupation, New York's spirit couldn't be extinguished. Spy rings operated in plain sight, with women like Elizabeth Bergen helping prisoners escape from the notorious Sugar House prisons. Hercules Mulligan, a flamboyant Irish tailor and friend of Alexander Hamilton, passed British secrets to Washington while measuring redcoats for uniforms. And in the countryside, just north of the city, the Culper spy ring, a network of farmers, merchants, and even a society woman named Anna Strong used coded messages and invisible ink to outmaneuver the British at every turn. When the war finally ended in 1783, New York faced a Herculean task of rebuilding. The British evacuation on November 25th, celebrated for generations as Evacuation Day, left a city scarred by fire and war. Its population halved, its docks rotting. But from these ashes rose something extraordinary. The newly independent United States needed a capital, and for 5 crucial years, from 1785 to 1790, New York served as the nation's first capital under the Constitution. Federal Hall on Wall Street, where Washington was inaugurated in April 1789, became the cradle of American government. Its balcony the stage for the first peaceful transfer of executive power in modern history. The post-war period saw New York reinvent itself with astonishing speed. The opening of the Bank of New York in 1784, co-founded by Alexander Hamilton, laid the foundation for Wall Street's future dominance. Newspapers, like the New York Gazette, flourished, their pages filled with debates about the new Constitution. And on the East River waterfront, shipyards began building vessels that would carry American goods, and, influence to every corner of the globe. By the dawn of the 19th century, New York had transformed from a war-torn colonial outpost into something unprecedented, the laboratory of a bold democratic experiment. The Erie Canal, just decades away, would amplify this momentum. But the city's true revolution had already occurred, not just in its politics, but in its very soul. New York had learned it could survive fire, war, and occupation, and emerge stronger each time. This resilience would become its defining characteristic as it marched toward its destiny as the world's greatest metropolis. But first, it would have to conquer itself, the gangs of 5 Points, the corruption of Tammany Hall, and the growing pains of a city exploding beyond its colonial boundaries. That struggle between chaos and progress, between the old world and the new would shape the next dramatic chapter in New York's extraordinary story. Chapter 3: Monuments and Mayhem. The forging of Gotham's iron spine. The morning fog clung stubbornly to the east river on July 4, 1825, as a peculiar procession made its way through the streets of Lower Manhattan. At its center marched DeWitt Clinton, former mayor and current governor, carrying a wooden casket filled with water from Lake Erie. Behind him trailed masons in aprons, militiamen in dress uniforms, and a ragtag collection of merchants and street urchins, all winding their way to the harbor where this strange liquid would be poured into the Atlantic. This theatrical ceremony marked the official opening of the Erie Canal ribbon of water that would do more than connect the Great Lakes to New York Harbor. It would transform a bustling port into the beating heart of an empire. The change came swiftly, violently. Where once the Collect Pond had mirrored the sky, near modern-day Folly Square, its waters, clean enough to drink, its shores dotted with picnicking families, now stood the 5 Point slum, a festering wound of overcrowded tenements built atop the recklessly drained lake bed. The neighborhood's rickety wooden houses leaned against one another like drunken sailors, their cellars perpetually flooded with brackish water that bred cholera and despair. Here, in the shadows of newly built courthouses and banks, a different New York thrived, one of gang wars between the Bowery Boys and Dead Rabbits, of basement dance halls where Irish immigrants perfected the jig steps that would evolve into tap, of underground saloons where stolen goods changed hands beneath the indifferent gaze of Tammany Hall's corrupt ward bosses. Yet even as this underworld flourished, the city's skyline began its upward march. In 1846, the Croton aqueducts, gleaming white arches, brought fresh water cascading into the city, its reservoirs supplying public fountains where immigrant children marveled at the novelty of clean drinking water. The same year, newspaper editor John L. O'Sullivan coined the term manifest destiny from his Broadway office, capturing the national zeitgeist while New York's shipyards built the vessels that would make that destiny possible. Down at the Battery, the cast-iron figure of Libertine, yet the colossal statue we know today, but a smaller version holding her torch aloft was being assembled, piece by piece, a symbolic prelude to the flood of immigrants about to descend upon the city. The streets themselves became battlegrounds for competing visions of progress. In 1858, Central Park emerged from 700 acres of swamps and rocky outcroppings, not through some organic process, but by the sheer will of Frederick Law, Olmsted, and Calvert Vaux, who deployed armies of Irish laborers to move 6 million cubic yards of earth. These same workers, paid pennies a day, often returned at night to the same 5-point squalor they were helping erase for the wealthy. The park's construction coincided with another revolution, the rattling ascent of elevated railroads along 9th Avenue, their steam engines showering sparks on pedestrians below as they carried clerks and shopgirls to new suburbs like Harlem. Then came the fire. Not the quick, cleansing burn of 1776, but a slow, smoldering conflagration of the soul. The draft riots of 1863, sparked by resentment over wealthy men buying their way out of Civil War service, turned Manhattan into a war zone for 4 blood-soaked days. Mobs lynched black citizens from lampposts, burned the colored orphan asylum to the ground, and battled police in the streets. By the time Union troops fresh from Gettysburg restored order, over 120 bodies lay in the morgues, though the true toll was likely higher. The riots exposed the city's deepest fractures between rich and poor, native and immigrant, white and black. Yet through this crucible emerged the indomitable spirit that would define modern New York. In 1868, the first stone was laid for the Brooklyn Bridge project that would claim 20 lives, including its visionary engineer John Roebling, who succumbed to tetanus after having his foot crushed during surveys. His son Washington took up the mantle, only to be crippled by casein disease known today as the bends from working in the pressurized underwater chambers. Bedridden but undeterred, he supervised construction through a telescope from his Brooklyn Heights apartment, while his wife, Emily, relayed his instructions to the workers. When the bridge finally opened in 1883, it wasn't merely a feat of engineering, it was a monument to the sheer stubbornness that had come to define New Yorkers. By the century's end, the city had physically transformed itself in ways that would astonish its colonial founders. The Croton Aqueduct's successor, the new Croton Dam, delivered enough water to supply a population exploding past 3 million. The first electric lights flickered to life along Broadway, the Great White Way, while below ground, workers began blasting tunnels for what would become the subway system. And on a small island in the harbor, French sculptor Frederick Auguste Bartholdi was assembling the final pieces of a copper colossus that would welcome the world's tired, poor, and huddled masses. This was the New York that entered the 20th century, a city of staggering contradictions, where Fifth Avenue millionaires built Renaissance palaces overlooking tenements, where families of 12 shared single rooms, where the same streets that had seen lynch mobs now hosted the nation's largest black community in Harlem, where the stench of the stockyards mingled with the perfume of ladies promenading in Central Park. The city had survived riots, epidemics, and financial panics, each time emerging stronger, more resilient, more determined to shape its own destiny. But the greatest tests still lay ahead. As the new century dawned, New York stood poised to claim its place on the world stage, not just as America's largest city, but as a global capital of finance, culture, and innovation. The age of skyscrapers was coming, and with it, a new kind of city that reached not just outward, but impossibly upward toward the heavens themselves. Chapter 4. Steel and Spectacle. The ascent of the modern metropolis. The wind howled through the steel skeleton 500 feet above Midtown, where ironworkers balanced on narrow beams without harnesses, their lunches wrapped in newspaper, tucked into jacket pockets. Below them, the city sprawled in all directions, a patchwork of brownstone roofs, church steeples, and the snaking curves of the elevated railroads. It was 1929, and the Chrysler Building was racing the Bank of Manhattan at 40 Wall Street to become the tallest structure on Earth. This wasn't just construction, it was alchemy, turning steel girders and immigrant ambition into the 20th century's most iconic skyline. New York had always reached upward, but now it did so with reckless, glorious abandon. The catalyst had come decades earlier, in 1884, when a Chicago architect named William LeBaron Jenney solved a seemingly impossible problem by using a steel frame to bear a building's weight instead of thick masonry walls. Structures could suddenly shoot toward the clouds. New York's architects seized this innovation with ferocious creativity. The Flatiron Building rose in 1902 like a ship's prow slicing through the intersection of Broadway and Fifth Avenue, its triangular shape creating wind tunnels that sent women's skirts, flanger, phenomenon so notorious that police officers were stationed to shoo away gawking men. But these early skyscrapers were mere preludes to the symphony of steel that followed. The Woolworth Building, completed in 1913, soared 792 feet into the heavens, its Gothic terracotta facade earning it the nickname the Cathedral of Commerce. Its construction was bankrolled entirely in cash by dime store magnate Frank Woolworth, $23 million stacked in neat piles in a bank vault, a physical manifestation of the city's growing financial might. At the opening ceremony, President Woodrow Wilson pressed a button in Washington that illuminated the building's 80,000 electric lights from afar, a technological marvel that left spectators gasping. Yet, for all their grandeur, these towers rested on foundations of human struggle. The workers who built them, mostly Irish and Italian immigrants, along with Mohawk ironworkers from the Conowake Reserve near Montreal, risked their lives daily. They balanced on narrow beams, with no safety nets, their hands calloused from driving red-hot rivets that sizzled when tossed hundreds of feet between them. 17 men died constructing the Empire State Building in 1931. Their stories overshadowed by the breakneck pace of construction, 4.5 stories per week, as the city raced to claim the title of world's tallest building during the depths of the Great Depression. That same year, another kind of ascent was happening underground. The first subway line had opened in 1904, its inaugural run carrying Mayor George McClellan, Jr., who reportedly took the controls himself and nearly overshot the station in his excitement. By the 1920s, the IRT and BMT lines formed, a sprawling network that carried over 2 million passengers daily, their routes dictating which neighborhoods would flourish. The clattering trains enabled clerks and factory workers to live in the outer boroughs, while keeping Manhattan within reach. Democratization of space that fueled the city's explosive growth. Above ground, New York was reinventing urban life itself. Times Square, once Longacre Square, became the world's crossroads after the New York Times moved its headquarters there in 19-0-4. Electric billboards turned night into day, their glow so intense that migrating birds sometimes circled them in confusion before collapsing from exhaustion. The neighborhoods, theaters, birthed American entertainment culture. From vaudeville's raucous comedy acts to the Ziegfeld Follies' glittering revues, where Florence Ziegfeld Jr. paraded his glorified American girls in feathered headdresses and scandalously sheer costumes. But the city's cultural renaissance wasn't confined to Midtown. Up in Harlem, the 1920s saw an explosion of black creativity that would reverberate worldwide. The Cotton Club and Apollo Theater hosted legends like Duke Ellington and Bessie Smith, while writers like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston chronicled the black experience in works that defined the Harlem Renaissance. Meanwhile, in Greenwich Village, bohemians gathered in basement speakeasies to discuss socialism and free love. Their conversations fueled by bootleg gin during Prohibition. The stock market crash of 1929 brought this gilded age to a brutal halt. On Black Tuesday, October 29th, crowds gathered outside the New York Stock Exchange as $11 billion evaporated in a single day. Millionaires jumped from hotel windows, bread lines snaked around entire city blocks, and Central Park became a makeshift shantytown nicknamed Hooverville. Yet even in despair, New Yorkers found ways to endure. Street vendors sold apples for 5 cents apiece, their stands licensed by a sympathetic city government. The newly completed Empire State Building stood half empty, earning the sardonic nickname the Empty State Building. Yet its observation deck became a beacon of hope, a place where ordinary people could still touch the sky. By the mid-30s, the city's resilience began to bear fruit again. Robert Moses, a master builder with a dictator's will, reshaped the urban landscape with parks, parkways, and bridges, though his projects often bulldozed through working-class neighborhoods with little regard for their residents. The 1939 World's Fair in Flushing Meadows promised the world of tomorrow. Its Trilon and Perisphere symbols of optimism on the eve of another world war. And in the Garment District, sewing machines hummed late into the night, producing uniforms for the coming conflict. Reminder that New York's destiny was now inextricably tied to global events. As the 40s dawned, the skyline stood as both a memorial and a prophecy. The Art Deco spires of the Chrysler and Empire State Buildings embodied the roaring 20s excess and ambition, while the rising housing projects in Brooklyn and the Bronx hinted at the city's next great challenge, providing for its millions in an era of uncertainty. The Metropolis had proven it could climb to impossible heights, but now, with war clouds gathering overseas, it would need to prove it could hold on to them. For New York was no longer just an American city. It was becoming the world's city. And the coming decades would test whether this urban colossus forged from steel, sweat, and dreams could bear the weight of that responsibility. Chapter 5: Concrete Dreams and Neon Nights. The city that reinvented the world. The summer of 1945 smelled like sweat, newsprint, and victory. Paper rained down from office windows as sailors kissed nurses in the middle of Times Square. The famous VJ Day photograph, capturing just one of 1,000 spontaneous celebrations erupting across the city. New York had emerged from the war, not just unscathed but transformed. Its factories had built the weapons that won the conflict. Its docks had shipped millions of soldiers overseas. And now, as the rest of the world lay in ruins, the city stood, poised to claim its destiny as the capital of the 20th century. The change came swiftly, violently beautiful. In the Bronx, the newly opened Cross-Bronx Expressway sliced through tight-knit neighborhoods like a surgeon's scalpel. Its construction, overseen by the indomitable Robert Moses, families who had lived in the same tenements for generations found themselves displaced overnight, their homes reduced to rubble to make way for 6 lanes of concrete. The expressway became both a symbol of progress and a warning New York would remake itself at any cost, even if it meant carving its own heart out in the process. Meanwhile, in a Greenwich Village jazz club called the Royal Roost, a young trumpeter named Miles Davis was reinventing music itself. The birth of bebop in smoky basement venues mirrored the city's post-war restlessness, a rejection of old forms, a hunger for something sharper, more complex. Up in Harlem, the Apollo Theater launched careers that would define American culture. James Brown's first explosive performances, Ella Fitzgerald's crystalline vocals, a teenage Aretha Franklin pounding the piano with church-bred fervor. The soundtrack of the city was changing, becoming more urgent, more alive. The streets themselves had become battlegrounds for competing visions of the future. In 1956, the wrecking balls arrived at the 3rd Avenue L, tearing down the last of Manhattan's elevated trains as part of Moses' grand vision for a city built around the automobile. Yet even as the Ls came down, something revolutionary was being born underground. The first air-conditioned subway cars debuted in 1967, their cool interiors offering respite from sweltering summer platforms. The city was shedding its industrial skin, though the process was far from painless. Nowhere was this metamorphosis more visible than in the sudden sprouting of glass towers along Park Avenue. The Seagram Building, completed in 1958, redefined corporate America with its bronze-clad austerity, far cry from the ornate skyscrapers of the Jazz Age. Its architect, Mies van der Rohe, had fled Nazi Germany, bringing with him the Bauhaus principle that less is more. Yet, for all their minimalist elegance, these new towers created wind tunnels that sent pedestrians scrambling and cast entire blocks in perpetual shadow. New York was learning that progress always came with unintended consequences. The cultural earthquake centered on a 4-block radius in the East Village. Andy Warhol's factory, with its silver walls and constant parade of drag queens, socialites, and drug addicts, became ground zero for the pop art movement. Here, Marilyn Monroe's face was silk-screened onto canvases, while Lou Reed's Velvet Underground played feedback-drenched sets to audiences of maybe 20 people. Just blocks away, Bob Dylan was rewriting the rules of popular music in cafes like the Gaslight, his nasal voice cutting through clouds of cigarette smoke. This was New York at its most creatively fertile, a place where poverty and genius danced. An endless tango, but the city's dark underbelly festered in plain sight. The 1964 Harlem riots, sparked by police brutality, left 1 dead and hundreds injured. The Stonewall Uprising of 1969, when drag queens and transgender patrons fought back against routine police harassment, ignited the modern LGBTQ rights movement in the wee hours of a sweltering June night. Even Times Square, that glittering symbol of American optimism, had become a neon-lit den of peep shows and heroin dealers by the 1970s. The Fear City pamphlets distributed to tourists during the fiscal crisis weren't wrong. New York was broke, dangerous, and seemingly on the brink of collapse. Yet, from this decay emerged unlikely beauty. Hip-hop was born in the rec rooms of the Bronx, where DJ Kool Herc extended the breakbeats of funk records to create something entirely new. Graffiti artists like Lee Quinones turned subway cars into moving murals, their vibrant tags declaring that even in the midst of urban decay, creativity couldn't be contained. And on the Upper West Side, a group of mostly black and Puerto Rican teenagers invented breakdancing on cardboard mats laid over concrete, their acrobatic moves a physical manifestation of the city's resilience. By the time the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center opened in 1973, New York had become a study in contradictions. The financial district gleamed with new skyscrapers while the South Bronx burned. Studio 54's disco balls spun for celebrity revelers as the Son of Sam terrorized the outer boroughs. The city that had welcomed generations of immigrants now teetered on the edge of bankruptcy, its subways covered in graffiti, its streets potholed and litter-strewn. But then, as always, New York reinvented itself. The 1980s brought Wall Street excess and a real estate boom that reshaped entire neighborhoods. Artists colonized abandoned lofts in Soho, only to be priced out a decade later when galleries followed. The AIDS crisis decimated the creative community, even as it galvanized activists like Larry Kramer to demand change. Through it all, the city endured, thrived even, because that's what it had always done. As the millennium turned, New York stood once again at a crossroads. The dot-com boom filled old factories with startups, while Mayor Giuliani's quality of life campaigns cleaned up Times Square at the cost of its gritty character. The city had survived fiscal crises, blackouts, and epidemics, but its greatest test still lay ahead. In the blue-skied September morning that would change everything. For now, though, the city pulsed with its usual relentless energy. In Queens, new immigrants from Asia and Latin America opened shops serving foods unimaginable to the Lenape. In Brooklyn, young professionals rediscovered brownstone neighborhoods their grandparents had fled. And everywhere, in every borough, in every language, the same unshakable belief persisted. This was the center of the universe, and its story was far from over. Chapter 6: Ashes and Steel. The unbreakable heart of a wounded city. The morning of September 11th, 2001, dawned with a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Office workers sipped coffee at outdoor tables in Lower Manhattan, enjoying what felt like the last perfect day of summer. At Windows on the World, the restaurant atop the North Tower, waiters prepared for a breakfast conference on risk management. No one could have imagined that within hours, those same windows would become the only exits for desperate souls choosing between fire and air. The first plane struck at 8:46 from the streets below. It looked like a horrific accident. 17 minutes later, when United Flight 175 banked sharply and tore into the South Tower. In that moment, everything changed. Office workers became first responders, running toward the carnage with no thought for their own safety. Firefighters from Engine Company 10, located directly across from the towers, didn't have to race to the scene. They were already there, staring up at a disaster beyond comprehension. The collapse of the towers sent a pyroclastic wave of dust and debris surging through the canyons of Lower Manhattan, turning day into night. People ran like ghosts, through the apocalyptic haze, faces caked with gray powder that contained the remains of buildings, computers, and human beings. At St. Paul's Chapel, George Washington's old church that had survived the Great Fire of 1776, miraculously unbroken stained glass windows looked out on a landscape that resembled wartime Dresden. Yet even as the towers fell, the city's resilience flickered to life. Boats of every description, ferries, tugboats, private yachts, formed an impromptu armada that evacuated nearly 500,000 people from Lower Manhattan, the largest maritime rescue in history. Over at Bellevue Hospital, doctors prepared for thousands of casualties that never came. Most victims had perished instantly or were trapped beyond reach. Instead, the waiting rooms filled with firefighters coughing up black phlegm, their lungs seared by toxic air. The days that followed were a blur of missing posters and candlelight vigils, the smell and nauseating cocktail of burning plastic, jet fuel, and something more primal hung over downtown for months. At Ground Zero, construction lights turned night into day as workers dug through the pile, finding twisted steel beams shaped like modern sculptures and, occasionally, a wallet or wedding ring that could be returned to grieving families. The city moved through its grief the only way it knew how, by working. By 2002, the first debates about rebuilding began. Should the entire site become a memorial? Should the towers be replicated exactly as they were? The arguments grew heated. This wasn't just about architecture, but about memory itself. When Daniel Libeskind's master plan was chosen, with its symbolic 1,776-foot Freedom Tower, later renamed One World Trade Center, not everyone was satisfied. Some wanted taller, some wanted shorter, but all agreed the skyline would never be the same. Meanwhile, the city's soul was healing in unexpected ways. The Tribute in Light installation, with its twin beams reaching skyward each anniversary, became a temporary but powerful symbol of remembrance. The spontaneous memorials that sprang up in firehouses and subway stations evolved into permanent exhibits, and the survivors, the window washer who rode the collapse down inside an elevator shaft, the stockbroker who walked down 8-9 flights with a burned hand, became living testaments to human resilience. The rebirth of Ground Zero moved at a glacial pace, fraught with political infighting and construction delays. But by 2014, the Oculus Santiago Calatravas' stunning white-winged transportation hub began welcoming commuters, its ribbed arches evoking a dove taking flight. The 9/11's memorials reflecting pools, set precisely in the tower's footprints, became places of pilgrimage, where visitors traced the names of loved ones with pencil and paper. New York had endured its darkest day and emerged changed but unbroken. The attacks revealed the city's true character, in the steel of its skyscrapers, but in the courage of its people. When the lights went out across the Northeast in the 2003 blackout, New Yorkers didn't panic. They shared flashlights and bottled water, remembering how much worse things could be. As the new World Trade Center tower climbed toward its symbolic height, something remarkable happened. The city, which had always prided itself on moving forward at breakneck speed, learned to carry its grief without letting it define the future. The wound would never fully heal, nor should it, but the scar became part of New York's story, another layer in its complex identity. 20 years later, the The rebuilt World Trade Center complex stands as both memorial and declaration. The whispering gallery of the Oculus, the vertigo-inducing glass floors of the observation deck, the quiet strength of the survivor tria. Pear tree rescued from the rubble that now flourishes in the Memorial Plaza wall tell the same story in different voices. New York can be wounded, but it cannot be defeated. The city's heartbeat, temporarily faltering on that September morning, now pulses stronger than ever. Rhythm carried in the footsteps of 8.5 million people who call this indomitable place home, because that's what New Yorkers do. They remember, they rebuild, and most importantly, they keep living, not in spite of everything, but because of it. The skyline may have changed forever, but the spirit that built it remains unshakable. And as the sun sets behind One World Trade Center, casting its long shadow across a city that knows both sorrow and strength, that spirit shines brighter than any memorial light. Chapter 7: Concrete Canyons and Digital Dreams. The Reinvention of a Metropolis. Sullenberger made the decision that would etch his name into New York lore. January 15th, 2009 began as an ordinary winter morning. Commuters scrolling blackberries on the A train, baristas steaming milk at midtown coffee shops, traders yawning through pre-market briefings until U.S. Airways Flight 1549 struck a flock of geese at 2,800 feet. In 3 miraculous minutes, an Airbus A320 became a glider, then a lifeboat, then a legend, floating onto the Hudson's surface as ferries raced to rescue all 150 souls aboard. The miracle on the Hudson became an instant metaphor for a city emerging from its own tailspin. The 2008 financial crisis had hit Wall Street like a sledgehammer, yet here was proof that New York could still stick the landing. When everything seemed lost, the years following 9/11, along the High Line, abandoned, elevated, what began as a grassroots preservation effort became one of the world's most innovative public spaces, sparking a billion-dollar transformation of West's Chelsea into a gallery district where converted warehouses showcased immersive digital art installations. The High Line's success proved something fundamental about 21st century New York. Its industrial past could be repurposed, but never erased. Town. Another metamorphosis was underway. Silicon Alley, once a 90s .com bubble joke, had matured into a legitimate tech hub as Twitter, Google, and Facebook planted flags in Art Deco skyscrapers near Union Square. The old Fulton Fish Market, where generations of Italian immigrants had haggled over bluefin tuna, now housed a WeWork where app developers sipped cold brew beneath exposed ductwork. This new economy brought staggering wealth. The average Manhattan apartment price surpassed $2 million in 2019, and, with it, a cultural shift. For the first time since the Gilded Age, innovation, yet the digital gold rush couldn't paper over growing fractures. When Hurricane Sandy's storm surge hit on October 29, 2012, it revealed the city still frighteningly vulnerable. The East Village's underground infrastructure, aging pipes and wires hidden behind trendy speakeasies, became saltwater-filled death traps. At NYU Langone Hospital, nurses carried newborns down darkened stairwells as backup generators failed. In Red Hook, Brooklyn, artisanal coffee shops found themselves sandbagging storefronts alongside century-old Italian bakeries. The recovery efforts laid bare uncomfortable truths about which neighborhood got help first and which continued waiting years later. The city's cultural heartbeat pulsed strongest where old and new collided. At the renovated King's Theatre in Flatbush, the 1964 World's Fair became both ruin and art installation. Its faded pastel tiles, a backdrop for Instagram shoots. Even Times Square, once synonymous with urban decay. Its pedestrian plazas filled with costumed characters hustling for photo tips. Then came the pandemic, when COVID-19 swept through New York in March 2020. It hit with terrifying speed. Refrigerator trucks parked outside hospitals became makeshift morgues. The nightly 7 o'clock applause for healthcare workers echoed through empty streets where Broadway marquees went dark for the first time since 9/11. The subway, the city's lifeblood, carried ghosts instead of commuters, its ridership dropping 90% in Jackson Heights. Immigrant families faced impossible choices between risking infection at essential jobs or losing their homes. The wealthy fled to second homes upstate or in the Hamptons, their departure captured in viral photos of empty Manhattan sidewalks where only the homeless remained. But just as, after 9/11, the city's darkest hour revealed its brightest spirit, Queens residents organized mutual aid networks to deliver groceries to elderly neighbors. The Jacob Javits Center transformed into a field hospital staffed by military doctors. And on Brooklyn rooftops, quarantined musicians played nightly concerts for their isolated neighbors. The sound of saxophones and violins drifting across the suddenly silent skyline. By 2022, the rebound was underway, messy, uneven, but undeniable. Broadway's lights flickered back on with Hadestown and Hamilton welcoming masked audiences. The Staten Island ferry once again carried tourists past Lady Liberty. And in Washington Square Park, the eternal chess players returned to their concrete boards, moving pieces beneath the arch as if nothing had changed, Devon as everything had. New York stood at another inflection point. The rise of remote work threatened its fundamental premise that proximity equaled prosperity. Yet the city had survived plagues, financial panics, and terror attacks before. Its secret weapon wasn't Wall Street or Silicon Alley, but something harder to quantify: the magnetic pull of 8.5 million stories colliding daily on crowded sidewalks, in bodegas, on subway platforms. The alchemy that turned strangers into neighbors, competition into community, concrete into home. As the sun set over a half-empty Midtown in 2023, the skyline told competing stories. Vacant office towers stood dark while Brooklyn brownstones sold for record prices. It only needed to become what it would be next. And if history was any guide, that next chapter would be as unpredictable as resilient. A plane landed safely. It was that 8 million people choose to land here every day, knowing full well how hard this city can crash, how high it can soar, and why, despite everything, there's still nowhere else quite like it. Chapter 8. The Phoenix Metropolis, New York's perpetual renaissance. The summer of 2023 smelled like scorched pretzels and damp concrete as a record-breaking heatwave pressed down on the city. In a Chinatown basement that had survived the pandemic's worst days, third-generation noodle makers hand-pulled Beyond strands next to a 20-something TikTok chef filming authentic culinary secrets for 2 million followers. Upstairs, the clatter of mahjong tiles mixed with the bass line from a pop-up club in a former funeral parlor. This was New York in its latest incarnation, a palimpsest where every crisis left scars. But every scar became fertile ground for something new. The city's rebound from the pandemic had defied predictions in typically contrarian fashion. Office towers stood half empty as remote work persisted. Yet the streets pulsed with a new energy. Part-time residents who'd fled in 2020, now embracing a 3 days in 4 days out hybrid existence. The garment district, once written off as a relic, buzzed with sustainable fashion startups cutting patterns in spaces where rolled buttonhole sellers still operated. Even the subway, its ridership still 20% below pre-pandemic levels, developed a new rhythm packed on Tuesdays through Thursdays, eerily quiet on Mondays and Fridays. A different kind of infrastructure was rising to meet this fluid new reality. Along the Brooklyn waterfront, the Domino Sugar Refinery's rusted skeleton had been transformed into a gleaming tech hub, its industrial bones preserved beneath glass atriums where programmers coded next to artifacts from the buildings. Sweet-smelling past the massive $25 billion Hudson Yards development, initially mocked as a rich person's theme park, gradually found its footing as a bizarre cultural hybrid where Neiman Marcus shared oxygen with avant-garde theater, and the vessel sculpture went from Instagram darling to suicide magnet to shuttered enigma. Yet the true rebirth was happening block by block in neighborhoods the guidebooks still missed. In the Bronx, the formerly abandoned PS31 school became a vibrant arts center, where Puerto Rican salsa legends taught masterclasses alongside Afrofuturist poets. Queens Plaza, once a dystopian tangle of highways underpasses, blossomed with green roofs and pedestrian plazas that made the area nearly unrecognizable to anyone who'd last seen it in the 90s. Even Staten Island Long, the forgotten borough, saw its North Shore renaissance accelerate as artists priced out of Bushwick discovered its Victorian charms. The cultural pendulum swung in thrilling new directions. Broadway, having survived its longest shutdown since World War II, came roaring back with audacious productions like A Strange Loop and Fat Ham that redefined who got to tell American stories. At the newly expanded MoMA, crowds lined up to see AI-generated art while purists grumbled about the death of human creativity in the gift shop line. Downtown, the once moribund punk scene found fresh life in illegal Chinatown lofts, where Gen Z bands channeled the spirit of 1978 CBGBs through a prism of TikTok fame and climate anxiety. Beneath this vibrant surface, old tensions simmered. The city's chronic housing crisis reached fever pitch as median rents hit $4,000 in Manhattan, pushing teachers, nurses, and service workers deeper into the outer boroughs or out of the city entirely. The bodega strike of 2022, when hundreds of corner stores closed to protest rampant shoplifting, highlighted the fragile ecosystem that kept neighborhoods fed, and the controversial opening of a casino in Coney Island reignited debates about who got to profit from New York's recovery and who got left holding the bag. The climate crisis became impossible to ignore. After Sandy, after Ida, after the 2023 Smoky Ocalypse, when Canadian wildfire haze turned the sky orange, the city launched ambitious resiliency projects. Floodgates rose in the financial district. Oyster beds returned to the harbor to buffer storm surges, and the first sections of the Big U seawall took shape around Lower Manhattan. Yet for all these efforts, each new disaster revealed vulnerability: subway tunnels that still flooded, public housing towers that lost power for days, wealthy high-rises that simply privatized their protection with backup generators and water pumps. Through it all, the city's essence remained unchanged. The morning commuters still elbowed for space on crowded platforms. The dollar-slice joints still did brisk business next to $20 avocado toast cafes. The eternal rhythms of ambition and survival played out daily in 1,000 different accents, from the Ukrainian deli owner in the East Village to the Senegalese street vendor outside the Met. From the hedge fund analyst rushing to a morning meeting to the 70-year-old woman who'd seen the city change more times than she could count. As the 25th anniversary of 9/11 approached, New York stood at another crossroads. The pandemic had accelerated trends that might have taken decades: the decline of traditional offices, the rise of remote work, the reordering of urban priorities. Yet the city had weathered far worse. The same adaptive spirit that turned abandoned rail lines into parks and bankrupt lofts into artist colonies now faced its greatest test, reimagining itself for an era when physical presence was optional, but human connection remained priceless. The answer, as always, lay in New York's secret ingredient: its people, the dreamers and doers, the hustlers and healers, the third-generation natives and newly arrived strivers who continued betting their futures on this impossible, irresistible city. They were already writing the next chapter in crowded comedy clubs where the next Jerry Seinfeld honed his craft, in Bronx science labs where students tackled climate change, in Flushing kitchens where immigrant chefs reinvented American food daily, because New York wasn't its skyline or its subway map or even its storied past. It was the collective act of 8.5 million people choosing every single date to build something greater than themselves. And as long as that continued, the city would keep rising, keep falling, and keep reinventing itself long after the current crises faded into history. The lights of Times Square still burned bright. The trains still ran mostly on time. The dream, against all odds and logic, lived on. And somewhere out in the 5 boroughs, the next great idea was taking shape: a dorm room, a food truck, a garage, a studio apartment, waiting for its moment to change everything again. Chapter 9: Crossroads of Tomorrow. New York's Dance with Destiny. The winter solstice of 2024 painted Manhattan in surreal hues as the setting sun aligned perfectly with the city's grid, setting the glass canyons ablaze in what astronomers call Manhattan hang. Crowds gathered along 42nd Street, smartphones raised to capture the celestial spectacle, while a new generation of street vendors sold solar-filtered eclipse glasses alongside halal cart chicken. This cosmic alignment felt symbolic, fleeting moment of harmony in a city perpetually torn between past and future, between memory and reinvention. The city's latest evolution defied easy categorization. In the financial district, where the ghosts of 9/11s still whispered through the canyons, a new breed of crypto entrepreneurs colonized Art Deco lobbies, their non-fungible token projects displayed where ticker tapes once scrolled. The old Fulton Fish Market, having already transformed into a tech incubator, now housed experimental marine biologists growing lab-developed scallops, alongside coders developing the next blockchain revolution. New York had always been a chameleon, but now its colors shifted faster than ever before. Housing had become the city's most visceral battleground. The collapse of the Airbnb gold rush during the pandemic left thousands of apartments vacant even as record numbers slept in shelters. In response, radical solutions emerged. Queen's Church converted its basement into micro-apartments for essential workers, while Brooklyn's Navy Yard began 3D printing modular housing units. The most controversial experiment unfolded in Midtown, where empty office towers underwent vertical conversions, their cubicle farms transformed into hybrid live-work spaces with shared kitchens and rooftop gardens. Critics called it dystopian. Residents praised the return of 24-hour neighborhood vitality. The cultural renaissance unfolding in the outer boroughs made Manhattan's elite uneasy. In the Bronx, the Universal Hip Hop Museum finally opened its doors near the birthplace of the genre, its interactive exhibits curated by the same pioneers who once threw block parties with stolen electricity. Queens celebrated its designation as the world's most linguistically diverse place with a Tower of Babel installation at Flushing Meadows, a spiraling structure where visitors could hear 137 languages spoken by local residents. Even Staten Island's North Shore, long the butt of jokes, became an unlikely arts destination as the massive New York wheel site transformed into an open-air sculpture park. Climate adaptation reshaped the city's relationship with its waterways. The first completed section of the Dry Line, a system of berms and retractable floodgates along Manhattan's eastern edge, successfully weathered its first major storm during the 2024 hurricane season. Meanwhile, the Billion Oyster Project reached its halfway mark, restoring the harbor's once thriving reefs to naturally filter water and blunt storm surges. Most strikingly, the abandoned Rockaway Railroad tracks blossomed into the city's most ambitious green corridor, linking neighborhoods to new tidal marshes designed to absorb rising seas. Yet, for all this progress, tensions simmered beneath the surface. The Great Restaurant Reckoning of 2025 saw hospitality workers unionize en masse, leading to a summer of brunchless Sundays as owners struggled with new labor costs. Autonomous delivery robots clogged sidewalks in Midtown, sparking Luddite riots where skateboarders toppled the mechanized interlopers. And the controversial MTA congestion pricing plan finally implemented after decades of debate created new friction between outer borough commuters and Manhattan's elite. The city's spiritual center of gravity continued shifting downtown. The completed 2 World Trade Center became an unexpected hub for climate tech startups. Its observation deck, featuring augmented reality, exhibits on rising sea levels. Nearby, the renovated South Street Seaport blended maritime history with cutting-edge culture. Fishermen still unloaded their catch at dawn, but by afternoon, the docks hosted augmented reality art installations, visible only through special glasses. As the 2030s loomed, New York faced its most profound questions yet. Could it remain affordable for the artists and immigrants who fueled its creative engine? Would remote work erode the serendipitous collisions that generated so much innovation? Could a city built on physical proximity thrive in an increasingly virtual world? The answers were taking shape in unexpected places. In a Red Hook warehouse, VR engineers designed digital twin versions of vanishing neighborhood institutions. At Columbia's new climate campus on Governor's Island, scientists worked on carbon capture technologies, alongside poets exploring new vocabularies for the Anthropocene. And in Washington Heights, a collective of Dominican grandmothers and Gen Z activists launched La Coquina del Futuro, blending ancestral food wisdom with vertical farming techniques. The true heartbeat of New York's future pulsed in these contradictions: the high-tech and the handmade, the global and the hyperlocal, the radically new and the stubbornly traditional. The city had survived pandemics, financial crashes, and terror attacks not by choosing one path forward, but by allowing 1,000 different futures to compete and coalesce. As midnight approached on New Year's Eve, 2029, the crowd in Times Square bore little resemblance to the buttoned-up revelers of Dick Clark's era. Climate activists waved glowing seaweed-based streamers. Drone light shows replaced some of the traditional fireworks. The new digital confetti, augmented reality, messages that appeared on smartphones when pointed at the Balkan-tained wishes. In 200 languages, when the clock struck 12, the cheer that rose from 8 million throats wasn't just for the new year. It was for the enduring miracle of New York itself, city that should never have worked, that constantly flirted with collapse, yet somehow kept rewriting its own destiny. The challenges ahead were monumental, but so was the collective genius of those who called this impossible metropolis home, because New York's secret had never been its skyline or its subways, but the alchemy that happened daily when dreamers and doers, pragmatists and poets, butchers and bakers and blockchain makers collided on its crowded streets. And as long as that magic endured, so would the city's ability to surprise the world and itself with whatever came next. Chapter 10: Eternal, becoming the unfinished symphony of New York City. The first light of January 1st, 2050, crept over Brooklyn Bridge Park, illuminating a scene that would have been unimaginable to the Lenape, unbelievable to the Dutch colonists, and incomprehensible to the Gilded Age tycoons. A floating oyster farm bobbed in the East River, its underwater gardens filtering the cleanest harbor water in 2 centuries. Along the shoreline, solar-powered benches charged the devices of early morning joggers whose augmented reality glasses overlaid historical images of the waterfront onto their retinas. High above, a silent swarm of delivery drones crisscrossed the skyline like mechanical starlings, weaving between the vertical gardens that now draped Manhattan's superatolls. This was New York in its latest incarnation, a city that had stared down extinction and chosen transformation. The climate adaptations of the 2030s had reshaped the city's relationship with its waterways. The completed Big U seawall now formed an elegant ribbon around Lower Manhattan, its elevated parks offering stunning views while protecting against storm surges. Where the FDR Drive once roared, a terraced estuary bloomed with salt-tolerant roses and marsh grasses, absorbing king tides that now regularly lapped at Battery Park's edges. The old joke about New York becoming the next Venice had taken on. Unexpected truth water taxis now rivaled yellow cabs in popularity, and kids in Red Hook learned to sail before they could ride bikes. Yet the city's soul remained stubbornly rooted in its past. The tenements of the Lower East Side, saved from demolition by historic preservationists, now housed hybrid live-work spaces where neurospatial Gen Z entrepreneurs, coded next to nonagenarian, rent-controlled tenants. Katz's Deli still served its legendary pastrami, though the meat now came from Brooklyn-based cellular agriculture labs. At the corner of Broadway and 42nd, the newly restored Paramount Theater hosted holographic performances of Sinatra and Streisand, alongside live avant-garde jazz, its marquee glowing as brightly as it had in 1926. The great paradox of mid-century New York was its simultaneous embrace of radical change and deep continuity. The subway system, having survived its near-death experience in the 2020s, now ran primarily autonomous trains, but still used the same MetroCard turnstiles from the 90s, a deliberate choice by the MTA to maintain tactile nostalgia. In Harlem, the Apollo Theater's amateur night competitors now included AI-generated soul singers, judged by audiences wielding quantum-encrypted voting devices. Even the Statue of Liberty had gotten an upgrade. Her torch now housed a climate research center, while her original flame rested in the museum below, preserved behind hurricane-proof glass. The city's cultural DNA continued mutating in unpredictable ways. Queens had become the global capital of fusion cuisine, where robotic chefs prepared recipes developed through machine learning analysis of every known culinary tradition. The Bronx's hip-hop heritage now fueled an entire sonic architecture movement, with buildings designed to resonate with specific sound frequencies. And in what had once been the meatpacking district, the Whitney Museum's extension floated on a barge that traveled between boroughs, its exhibitions curated by collective intelligence algorithms trained on every Yelp review ever written. The most profound changes were social. The universal basic income experiment, launched during the pandemic, had, against all expectations, fueled a creative renaissance rather than complacency. With housing costs finally stabilized by the 50-50 law, mandating that half of all new construction be permanently affordable, New Yorkers found themselves with something unprecedented time to think. The results were everywhere. In the community quantum computing labs of Brownsville, in the vertical hydroponic farms of the Lower East Side, in the pop-up philosophy salons that appeared in former bank vaults and abandoned subway tunnels. Yet, for all its technological wonders, the city's magic still lived in its human moments. The elderly Ukrainian woman who still sold sunflowers outside St. George's Church in the East Village, though her stall now accepted cryptocurrency. The third-generation bodega cat that napped beneath a holographic inventory display. The way the morning light hit the Chrysler Building's gargoyles, exactly as it had in 1931, even as their copper surfaces now contained microscopic sensors monitoring air quality as the city prepared to celebrate its 400th anniversary in 2525. Archaeologists made a startling discovery beneath a parking lot near Pearl Street. The original wooden pilings of Fort Amsterdam, preserved in the anaerobic mud, still bore tool marks from the Dutch colonists. The excavation site became an overnight sensation, a tangible connection to the city's founding moment, now protected beneath a transparent carbon fiber floor in the lobby of the Bank of America Tower. Standing at this archaeological site on a crisp autumn morning, it was possible to see all of New York's ages simultaneously. The Lenape shell middens beneath the financial district, the colonial cobblestones under Wall Street, the steel bones of the skyscrapers, and the graphene filaments of the newest towers. The city had become what the poet Whitman had always known it to be, not a fixed place, but a process, a perpetual becoming. The challenges ahead were formidable. The rising seas would keep coming. The geopolitical storms would keep raging. The next pandemic was only a mutation away. But as the sun set over the harbor, painting the skyline in fiery hues, one truth remained self-evident: New York would endure, not because its foundations were unshakable, but because its people had learned to dance upon shifting ground. For this was the final, eternal lesson of New York City, that resilience is not about resisting change, but embracing it, not about preserving the past, but building upon it, not about surviving the future, but designing it. The city's greatest monument was not any single building or bridge, but the living, breathing, ever-evolving masterpiece created daily by 9 million stubborn dreamers who refused to believe anything was impossible. And so the story continues, not with an ending, but with a semicolon, not with a period, but with an invitation. The next chapter begins tomorrow at sunrise, when the bodegas flip their signs to open, when the first trains roll out of the yards, when the dancers at Alvin Ailey stretch their limbs toward another day of creation. The greatest New York story is always the one about to be told. After all, the city never sleeps. It only pauses to catch its breath.